What's up, dudes? Max here. So I had a pretty unique opportunity again over the past week to check out probably one of the most anticipated games we've seen over the past 3 years, and it's a shock that, it's been 3 years and not, over 5 between the release of this thing. But yeah, we're on the cusp of the release of Final Fantasy XVI. Thanks to Square Enix, we got to go down to their offices and try out the latest builds of the game. I'm going to give you some impressions on my own, coming from like kind of an action game perspective of what we can expect in Final Fantasy XVI and what this means for the genre moving forward. So the big first impression we got from the first trailer, the first time we saw Final Fantasy XVI, is that this really looks like a character action game. Everything about it is kind of going in a different direction. Square Enix has kind of been doing this since like Kingdom Hearts technically, and it kind of came to a head with Final Fantasy VII, remake, taking a lot of elements from action games, but also incorporating a lot of RPG stuff from the original game. Final Fantasy XVI seems to be heading even more in the action game sort of focused direction. I also want to clear up what was playable, because there's been a lot of different builds of Final Fantasy XVI, and we got pretty much access to all of it within this play session. It probably ended up being between like 5, maybe even 6 hours of total playtime, which is a lot. Between all of it, there were newer builds and updated builds, and also some of the older stuff that you might have seen showing up at previous events, between like the action build, storming the castle, stuff like that. And the first part of the game is heavily focused on Clive being younger, right? So he's like around a teenager, and most of these areas are acting as introductory, getting you used to what this game is setting up for, and it's a very good primer for going into Final Fantasy XVI, because it is literally the start of the game. Outside of that, we get to play a little bit more of him in his 20s, which is sort of opening up to what the game actually is outside of the tutorial. And then there were other bigger demos. Like I said, that castle demo was in here, which really focuses on combat, and another demo that focuses on big Eikon versus Eikon battles, also very cool. But ultimately, there's some differences between them, the older action demo and the Eikon battle stuff. There was also a latest like updated build. It seemed to be a little bit later in the game. Granted, I think most of the stuff we played was in the first quarter of Final Fantasy XVI. It was the first like big area where you go to like a marsh, and there was a lot of openness to it, a lot of roaming enemies, and some side quests, some minor side quests that you could do to sort of give you a feel that it isn't all just like corridors and small action sequences and stuff like that. There are some areas to explore. Now, the number one thing that's on my mind when talking about Final Fantasy XVI is the action. It is clearly the forefront of this entire game. And the entire experience that I can sort of recall of what I played is extremely action-oriented and pretty much lines up with what the devs have been describing Final Fantasy XVI as, which is a roller coaster. That term makes even more sense after you get your hands on with the game. Because yes, they set up for a lot of Final Fantasy XVI to be this absolute cinematic, crazy action adventure that really is like a roller coaster, where what you're getting on that roller coaster is insane and it is absolutely wild, but it mostly can be what you expect. And that's what it kind of is at the start. Final Fantasy XVI is very much what you expect it to be. There's not a lot of like deviating from that path, but granted, this is like the beginning of the game for the most part, so who knows how much that's going to expand later on. So let's talk about that really important part, the action. How does the action feel in the game? At least from the Final Fantasy games and other Square Enix titles that have tried to tackle this action thing over the past, nearly 20 years, this one easily feels the best. The feel of the game is genuinely fantastic.
No holding back.
And what they have done is clearly take inspiration from many other action game franchises of the genre that have done things that just simply work. They incorporate them in a specific way that makes you feel all but familiar, that like, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense why this is here, why this works like that. Let's talk about like the control scheme and what it's setting up for. And one of the most interesting parts is the attack button, because there is just one technical attack button. There's only one regular attack. There is no like light attacks or heavy attacks or anything like that. Your attack button does something anywhere between like a 1 to 4 hit combo, and the same thing in the air. Then it does slightly different variations, but that's about it. Where Final Fantasy XVI is different than other action games, or similar in some ways. There's modifications to things all over the place, especially within the stances of the game, which is like the summons. Those really add a degree of alteration to your regular attack patterns, as well as the magic button, which was attached to triangle. Now, the magic button changes depending on which summon stance you're in, between like Garuda, between Titan, or Ifrit. The game starts with that, right? It starts off with this like basic formation where you have like fire attacks. So you just sort of shoot fire at enemies. I would normally be kind of cause for concern because you just have this general one attack button and it does the same attack string over and over again. But the cool part is that they integrate the fire attack into that. So you can modify your attacks to sort of tack on fire, almost like a gunblade kind of situation in Final Fantasy VIII. So if you attack and press the magic button after, he'll essentially strike, add fire. You can do strike, fire, strike, fire, strike, fire, and do like a big one in the end. And that's pretty neat. It also works in aerial attacks as well, and it has a little interesting amount of timing to it if you want to like tack on these attacks. So it is pretty cool. I think there would be an interesting variance if we did get more attacks in general, because how they specify special moves in the game, like so how do you do like special attacks? Is it like back forward or forward with the attack button? It's actually not. In Final Fantasy XVI, they use it with 2-button attacks. So it's like square and X is jump. And yes, luckily Clive actually has a jump button and some interesting additions to that too. But if you press square and X, which is your attack button and your jump button, you'll do special moves. And those sort of boil down to Stinger. Of course, you get a Stinger. And of course, in the air, you get a Helm Breaker. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense considering the pedigree of action games and where this stuff sort of comes from. It definitely has that kind of feel. And yeah, after you do them, you can also tack on magic moves and do cool stuff. I think those were the only few technical special moves. It was like regular attacks, like Stinger, and then Helm Breaker, which is the jumping, down strike. But we didn't get to see every single special move that was available in the game, right? So there might be other ones that are around, because there's a lot more to talk about, which is how does the summon stuff work, right? How do these summon stances affect everything? And that's where the circle button comes in. The circle button is your essential gimmick button, I call it, because it changes depending on which summon you have. If you have the Ifrit stance, right, the fire stance, you're going to do this big homing in dash, which covers a big amount of distance and is kind of available to you at all times. With Garuda, it was a big command grab that gives you a lot of like aerial mobility. And then on Titan, it was a big shield that would just block most attacks, it felt like, and it might have more gimmicks. So that's like always available. You can always do those things on the circle button. However, there is modifier attacks where if you press like R2 button, I think it was square and triangle or square and X, these now turn into like specials, and they're big special moves that differ per summon stance you use, and there's a lot of ones you can unlock, and they change parameters. You can level them up. There seem to be a decent variety. Those are cooldown based, so you're gonna have to wait some time for them to eventually come back. They're really great for those moments that you've seen where enemies get staggered, where they essentially lose the will to fight for a second. They're really fun for that because you'll just like drop all the fire ones, all the Titan ones, all the Garuda ones, like all at once, and just completely do as much damage as you possibly can because it's getting multiplier. It is different how Final Fantasy XVI is setting up its action elements, because while it does still have like a gun, the triangle attack is pretty much a gun that you remember from the majority of action games. But in this one, you can do other stuff with it. You can charge it a la Nero, which is cool. My only gripe with it is that on the default control scheme, it's on triangle. And if you want to charge that attack, which is great because it's a big, powerful strike, it can be kind of difficult to do so. There's also a charge attack where you can like imbue your weapon with like a big fire sword if you hold down the attack button. So that leads to some weird controllerness where you have to like crab claw it if you want to keep this one charged and the other one. I think there's definitely an alternate control scheme that'll be preferred, where the magic attack is on the top buttons, because that's where the dodge usually is in the modifier. It'd probably be better if it was up there. So all in all, action feels super good. Clive feels like an absolute insanely kitted character, more so than anything I've played in a Square Enix game before, but definitely comparable and different than other action games because they're doing some very unique stuff with these like summon stances that you sort of get per character. And I don't want that to come across as daunting, because one of the things that Final Fantasy XVI does very well is sort of ease the player into this stuff, because you start off with a very, very limited tool set. Action games sort of throw you into the ringer a lot of the time, and even the default kits that action game characters get can be sort of like daunting to some people. I got the feeling that Final Fantasy XVI is aware of that, and they're really going to take these situational moments to teach you like, this is what this is good for. This is where you want to use this. If you want to start leveling this up, we can help you with that. They're absolutely considering the fact that we don't want you to just immediately be thrown into the deep end of the action game, iceberg. They don't want to do that. There's going to be this sprawling adventure where you learn a lot of this stuff with your character, and you definitely feel that in the first like chapters, which act as pretty big tutorial sequences where a lot of the enemies are kind of fodder-like, and they want you to get used to how to pilot your character and use these things at the right time. You also unlock a bunch of different abilities, and it seems like the way you unlock things in the game is very much around like the action game mindset, right? You get naturally levels up, which make your character more powerful, and you can get other things like accessories and stuff like that that can also alter your character's stats in minor ways. But really, like the heavy RPG stats or what seemingly is like extravagant builds or things that you can do in most RPG games aren't really here. It feels like the unlock tree and the unlock path for Clive and what he can get, at least with the the very limited time we've had with the game. And I don't think it's representative of the whole game. There's probably a lot more stuff eventually. But even from what we saw, it's very much in the same vein of like, how do you unlock things for characters in action games? It's very similar. So you're going to spend your currency that you have in the game to unlock new moves or buff out existing special moves, make them more powerful, things like that. And if you've ever played like a Devil May Cry or Hi-Fi Rush or any of these latest action games that have come out like Bayonetta, it'll all be pretty familiar how you make your character better. So let's talk about world, how Final Fantasy XVI functions, like how the game sets up for you to go to hubs and do quests and things of the like. We've already seen that there is a world map. There is traversal areas that you can go in between, but there is essentially zones, right? It is zone focused, where when you exit or enter certain areas, they kind of have that same dotted line that you get in, I think that's Final Fantasy XIV, which presents you with like a loading screen and you enter the next area. It seems to be, at least from the first quarter of the game, that's kind of how it's set up, where the world map kind of acts as a sort of like a Final Fantasy X map in many ways, and you go between each area. I from everything that we saw so far, there isn't like we're just gonna walk from point A to point B and there's not gonna be any loading or anything like that. No, it was very much like, here's the world map, you can point at this place, go to that place, point at that place, go to that place. Even though we didn't have access to a lot of them, it very much appeared to be the case there. And the majority of the journey, especially in the first like 3 hours, where it's a lot of tutorial and introduction and establishing characters, the majority of the game is very much on rails, and everything about it is, like I explained, that roller coaster kind of experience. It's very exciting, sets up for some crazy boss battles, some crazy conflicts, and some very cool moments. Most of it is guided by a cinematic story experience that will bring you from point A to point B. And granted, there are bigger zones and bigger areas that will eventually open up outside of castle sieges that are relatively focused and linear. There is moments where you're going to get to like a marsh, like I said, that we got to play, and I killed nearly every single enemy and found every single thing in this marsh. Took me like a couple hours. And that was fun, but it wasn't the most like explorative experience of my life. There was like a very basic side quest that happened there. Talk to this guy, go to this point later on. It felt like it was still pretty early in the game. I feel like that's one of the first like larger areas that you're gonna actually run into. It was fun. I think I might have enjoyed that part the most, even though the crazy cinematic story stuff that happens in between these moments is ridiculously cool, and just the spectacle of it all is mind-blowing that the PlayStation 5 is producing these images. I do hope that we eventually do find different parts later on that just open up for bigger areas and more exploration, because even from the big marsh area we got, it's pretty limited where you can actually go. It's just much larger in comparison. There is also the basic headquarters / hub where you can sort of come back and refresh gear and talk to like blacksmiths and item traders and things of the like. And in between there is obviously stuff that you'll be able to do more later on. Granted, we didn't have much we can do with crafting at the beginning. There wasn't like crazy new gear that we could make or new swords. I think I upgraded my sword once and it kind of looked the same. I do really hope that stuff opens up later down the line, where there's a lot more really interesting stuff that you can do between going on hunts to get this gear or these items that'll need to unlock this stuff to change some appearance or do something like that. Everything we played so far, it didn't really feel like you can change Clive's appearance in this version of the game, or at least this early part of the game. So I do hope that opens up at some point down the line. And in these hub areas, there was also side quests, and I think there was like 3 total side quests. There was that one in the marshes I talked about that was pretty simple. And yeah, the ones in the headquarters area are even more simple, to the point where you go talk to like a restaurant NPC, like in like a pub, and you serve people their food and they give you some minor backstory. It's really simple. And then there's another one where you deliver some wood to like a carpenter guy, and it's just right across the way, and you just walk back and forth and do it. And you just get a little bit of text that explains sort of the backstory of what's going on here. No other quests in this build of the game, or the builds that we played, were any different than that. Every single quest, which was just about 3, pretty much did that. So I definitely think that the side quests should 100% be more interesting later on, and I have no doubt that they will be. It's just that the ones they set up for right now are kind of like the most basic starting quests that you can possibly ask for, and there was no other hunts or anything like that that you could do. But at least in these demos, the side questing was pretty simple, at least to start. Going back a second ago to what we were talking about visually, I think the game is visually ridiculous looking. I think it looks great, especially in action. And the cinematics, the character faces, everything looks really good. Some lighting like isn't the best in some moments, and yeah, that what's it called? That one castle siege, which is very dark, that we all saw in that previous demo. I'm pretty sure it was the exact same demo I played, and yes, it is very dark. It's kind of hard to see what exactly is going on with some of the action in that specific scenario. But it also didn't help that some of the demos we played were locked to 30 FPS even during combat. They mentioned that those were a bit older, that the performance of the game might not have been ironed out yet, because the later builds, which was the full intro we played as well as the big marsh area, yes, the combat situations were running at 60 FPS if you chose performance mode, which is of course what I chose. And it was significantly better. It was easier to see stuff, easier to gauge what's going on. There's a lot of crazy particle effects, and the Eikon battles are just, insane. So it's getting a better visual eye on what's happening, and I'm very glad that, yeah, okay, so 60 FPS is enabled in all these fights. That's great. The only gripe I have is that when you're running around in the world and just exploring and looking at stuff, it runs at 30. And it immediately switches to 60 as soon as you enter combat with enemies in some way, which is good, because that's where the most precise inputs are going to be required. But it does kind of bug me that running around just the environment is only in 30 FPS, at least in the builds we played. So I do hope that actually changes at some point down the line. I hope they alleviate that to allow for just regular exploration, to give us higher frame rate as well. And it seems kind of weird that it locks it to 30 and then bumps it up to 60, especially in combat. So if there's one big gripe I have with the visuals of Final Fantasy XVI, it's that. It's that we can't enjoy the environments at a proper frame rate, and moving the camera around and looking at stuff that's kind of locked to 30 FPS at the moment. So we talked a whole bunch about gameplay, a whole bunch about action and how the controller works and how Clive works and all this wild stuff he can do. Let's talk about story. I don't want to really spoil much, because I feel like I have already been spoiled on a ton of Final Fantasy XVI already, as is, just by playing so much of the game. But yeah, story-wise, this is setting up for a much more mature and a much different feeling Final Fantasy story than we've ever seen in a mainline Final Fantasy, probably harking back to something closer of Final Fantasy Tactics. A lot of like betrayal and a lot of what feels like a very Square Enix version of what the Game of Thrones kind of wants to be. It feels like that was almost a direct influence on what they wanted Final Fantasy XVI's story to be. So yes, we're going to get a lot of adult themes, a lot of F-bombs. I was relatively shocked how much characters drop the F-bomb, even more so than like a Resident Evil Capcom game or something like that. It was pretty surprising, but at the same point, yes, there's just a lot of gore and a lot of adult themes scattered throughout this. So this isn't, your old mama's or your daddy's Final Fantasy of yore. No, they're going for something that is tailor-made for a specific audience, and between gameplay and thematic direction and what they're going for with this like roller coaster kind of ride, it's trying to be something different than Final Fantasy ever has before. The plot itself isn't the most dynamic thing that you've ever seen, but What I like about it is that it's simple, and in a lot of RPGs, especially JRPGs that can get really complex really fast, and you just don't know why we're going here or what we're doing, it's keeping it simple, at least at the start, where there's not a ton of characters in play, and they're really trying to keep it like focused around this one guy's story and the characters that are around him. And it allows you to get emotionally attached. It allows you to, like, you know, see what's happening with these characters, and their motivations are clear and present. And I very much prefer like the simple side of storytelling. Just tell me a simple story done really effective. And it feels like that's what they're kind of setting up for, at least at the beginning, where we're almost going back to like the classic tales of, you know, crystals and summons and stuff like that, which is what Final Fantasy is all about. So overall, a lot of really good impressions. I left this gameplay session just wanting more. I didn't get burned out by any of this stuff. I just, every single like Eikon versus Eikon battle I played, which was only a couple, between the introduction, playing Clive as like a teenager, a little bit of it in his 20s, and then also playing some of the bigger open areas, like I just wanted to go around and see what I could do and what was possible gameplay wise. And luckily it seems like they give your character and you the ability as the player quite a bit of sauce, and that's important. The game is going to give you these tools, like you can unlock enemy steps, and now you can jump off enemies and cancel your animations in the air with jumping animations. I'm like, oh, okay, they get it. They clearly get how this works. But of course, there are still some concerns that I have, and funny enough, one of them is actually the RPG elements of the game, because in the first whatever, I mean, it might just be like the first quarter of Final Fantasy XVI. I don't even know how big of what we played is, but it's definitely within the first quarter. There really isn't a lot of stuff that is like super RPG stat management or things that you would expect like in potentially like a big Final Fantasy RPG. There's nothing as crazy dynamic as like the materia thing in Final Fantasy VII Remake. The most you can change stat wise, and you know, outside of just leveling up your character and acquiring more levels and getting more powerful, is accessory slots, and that was pretty much relegated to here's more defense, here's more offense, here's something that makes this special move like 8% better, and your sword and a bracer and maybe one other thing. And those are just like stat increases. The majority of big change you see on your character is in the kind of like the action element window, which is all your abilities. And all those abilities unlock pretty much just like an action game, you know? We're obviously getting materials and gathering stuff and getting things that we're eventually going to use, and we just don't really ever get to use in this version of the game. So I'm looking forward to the later portions of Final Fantasy XVI, like after the middle of the game, to see kind of how that opens up and what it deviates for. And it's like, oh yeah, so here's where you're gonna be spending a lot of your time doing this stuff outside of just like main story stuff. It feels like they're setting up for those moments. It's just that we don't see that, so it's only a slight gripe that, yeah, I kind of would love to see how much more of the RPG-ness of the game would kick in, outside of the fact that there's just so much cinematic storytelling stuff happening throughout most of the playthroughs that I had. That's really where it's like, oh yeah, so we're just really getting into the story of Clive and all of his backstory and who's interacting with him. That's where the RPG part really is kicking in. So that's it, Final Fantasy XVI, the game that we've been talking about for a few years now, and it's once again crazy to think that we might get a Final Fantasy within 5 years of it being announced, like a brand new main title Final Fantasy. And it's really shaping up to be something special and very different, right? This is definitely taking you on a roller coaster style experience where doesn't seem to be a ton of deviation from this crazy like action thing that they have, but we don't know the full breadth of it because clearly there's going to be a lot more places to go, a lot more things to do later on in Final Fantasy XVI, and we're only seeing like one small slice of what this entire game is. Although granted, pretty big slice. Like I said, it was like 6-ish hours, but they take these moments, like here's this big action moment, here's this open world moment, here's these Eikon battles. They're trying to get you all like the pinnacles of the game. As of right now, it really plays out like a character action game, and one with a lot of like cinematic presence and story, and I'm curious where it goes, and I'm curious where eventually we're going to take all these skills and stuff and how the quote-unquote Final Fantasy difficulty is going to be handled. I really hope it's something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, because that had an amazing hard mode where they took away items. I hope it's something like that, where if you eventually beat the game and unlock this harder difficulty, where they kind of make you approach everything of Final Fantasy XVI and its engagement in a different way. So I'm very much looking forward to this when it comes out. We're going to have a full playthrough going up on the channel. Until then, thank you dudes a ton for watching. I appreciate a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. My name is Max, and I'll see you guys next time.